In the summer of 2025, American politics was dominated by a single piece of legislation. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick with anticipation, and the city's iconic marble buildings seemed to hum with the energy of what was unfolding. For months, the nation's attention had been drawn to the Capitol, where lawmakers, lobbyists, and citizens alike were fixated on the fate of a bill that promised to alter the very fabric of American society. It was a bill so vast and ambitious that, honestly, both its supporters and detractors agreed on one thing: it would reshape the nation's economic and social landscape for a generation. The scale of the proposal was unprecedented, and the stakes could not have been higher. In the halls of Congress, heated debates raged day and night, with lawmakers from both parties grappling with the bill's sweeping implications. Outside, crowds gathered, some in support, waving flags and chanting slogans, others in protest, holding signs and demanding their voices be heard. Officially titled the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OBBB Act, this colossal 1,000-page document became the centerpiece of President Donald Trump's second term. The bill was a testament to the administration's ambition, a legislative behemoth that dwarfed anything seen in recent memory. Its pages were filled with dense legal language, complex formulas, and sweeping directives that touched nearly every corner of American life. For President Trump, the OBBB Act was more than just a policy proposal. It was a legacy-defining moment, a chance to cement his vision for the country. It was not merely a tax bill or a spending plan. It was a grand, sweeping vision that touched nearly every facet of American life. From the bustling cities to the quiet rural towns, from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the kitchen tables of Main Street, the OBBB Act promised to leave no American untouched. It sought to redefine the relationship between citizens and their government, to redraw the boundaries of what was possible in public policy. From the taxes paid by working families to the funding for national defense, from the rules governing immigration to the future of clean energy, the OBBB Act was designed to be a definitive statement of policy and priorities. It bundled together a dizzying array of initiatives: sweeping tax reforms, major increases in military spending, new investments in border security, and a controversial overhaul of federal support for social programs. The bill also included provisions for infrastructure, education, and even technology, aiming to position the United States as a leader in the global economy for decades to come. The sheer scale of the bill was staggering, bundling together provisions that, in any other political era, might have been debated as separate, landmark laws. Congressional staffers worked around the clock, poring over the fine print, analyzing the potential impacts, and fielding calls from constituents desperate to understand how the bill would affect their lives. The legislative process was a marathon, with committee hearings stretching late into the night and lawmakers forced to make difficult compromises in the name of progress. It promised permanent tax relief for millions of Americans, echoing the deep cuts passed during Trump's first term. For many families, the prospect of lower taxes was a welcome relief, a chance to keep more of their hard-earned money and invest in their futures. The bill's supporters argued that these tax cuts would spur economic growth, create jobs, and unleash a new era of American prosperity. They pointed to the successes of the past and insisted that the OBBB Act would build on that foundation, delivering tangible benefits to households across the country. At the same time, it proposed dramatic reductions in federal spending on social safety net programs, affecting everything from food assistance to health care for the nation's most vulnerable. Critics warned that these cuts would leave millions of Americans at risk, stripping away vital support at a time when many were still struggling to recover from economic hardship. The debate over the bill's impact on the social safety net became one of its most contentious aspects, with passionate arguments on both sides about the proper role of government in caring for its citizens. The legislation also included a massive injection of funds for border security and a significant boost to the military budget. Supporters hailed these measures as essential for protecting the nation's sovereignty and ensuring its safety in an increasingly uncertain world. The bill called for new investments in advanced military technology, expanded training for service members, and the construction of additional barriers along the southern border. These provisions were designed to send a clear message: America would remain strong, secure, and unyielding in the face of external threats. Supporters hailed it as a bold strategy to unleash economic growth and secure the nation's borders, while critics warned it was a reckless gamble that would explode the national debt and deepen societal divisions. The country seemed to split into two camps, each convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Town halls and community centers became battlegrounds for heated debates, with citizens voicing their hopes and fears about what the future might hold. The OBBB Act was more than just a collection of policies, it was a political phenomenon. News outlets devoted wall-to-wall coverage to the bill's progress, with pundits dissecting every twist and turn. Social media buzzed with hashtags and viral videos, as Americans from all walks of life weighed in on the debate. The bill became a symbol of the country's deep divisions, but also of its enduring capacity for passionate civic engagement. It represented a high-stakes bet by President Trump, who tied his legacy directly to its passage. For the president, the OBBB Act was the ultimate test of his leadership and vision. He crisscrossed the country, rallying supporters and urging lawmakers to back the bill. In speeches and interviews, he framed the legislation as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to restore American greatness and secure a brighter future for all. He presented it to the public not as a complex legislative package, but as a simple, powerful promise to make America stronger and more prosperous. The president's messaging was clear and direct, cutting through the noise of Washington politics to reach ordinary Americans. He spoke of jobs, security, and opportunity, painting a picture of a nation on the cusp of a new era. The bill's very name, the One Big Beautiful Bill, was a classic piece of Trump branding designed to be memorable and to convey a sense of overwhelming positive change. The phrase appeared on banners, hats, and bumper stickers, becoming a rallying cry for supporters. It was a name that promised simplicity and clarity in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. This branding turned the complex, often tedious process of lawmaking into a national drama, capturing the attention of the country and forcing every citizen to consider what kind of future they wanted. Families gathered around their televisions to watch the latest developments, while friends debated the bill's merits over coffee and dinner. The OBBB Act became a topic of conversation in workplaces, schools, and places of worship, uniting and dividing Americans in equal measure. As the bill made its way through Congress, it became a focal point for the deep political and cultural divides in the United States. The legislative process exposed fault lines that had been simmering beneath the surface for years, bringing them into sharp relief. Lawmakers faced intense pressure from their constituents, with some receiving threats and others hailed as heroes. The debate over the OBBB Act was about more than just policy, it was about the soul of the nation. The debate was fierce, with passionate arguments unfolding on the floors of the House and Senate, on cable news and in town halls across the country. Lawmakers delivered impassioned speeches invoking the Founding Fathers and the Constitution, while citizens packed public hearings to share their stories. The nation watched as its leaders grappled with questions of fairness, justice, and the common good. Every line item, every provision was scrutinized and contested. Committees held marathon sessions, poring over amendments and negotiating compromises. Lobbyists swarmed the Capitol, representing interests from every corner of the economy. The process was messy, chaotic, and at times deeply frustrating, but it was also a testament to the enduring strength of American democracy. For those who supported it, the OBBB Act was a long overdue course correction, a necessary step to unshackle the economy and reinforce traditional American values. They saw the bill as a bold rejection of what they viewed as years of government overreach and stagnation. Supporters believed that by cutting taxes, reducing regulation, and investing in national security, the country could reclaim its place as a beacon of freedom and opportunity. For those who opposed it, it was a dangerous overreach, a giveaway to the wealthy that was paid for on the backs of the poor and middle class. Critics argued that the bill's tax cuts disproportionately benefited the rich, while its spending cuts threatened to unravel the social safety net. They warned that the OBBB Act would deepen inequality, increase poverty, and leave the most vulnerable Americans behind. In the heated political climate of 2025, the OBBB Act was not just a bill, it was the bill that would define an era. Its passage, or failure, would shape the nation's trajectory for years to come, influencing everything from the economy to the culture, from the halls of power to the lives of ordinary Americans. As the sun set over the Capitol, the country held its breath, waiting to see what kind of future the One Big Beautiful Bill would bring. The story of the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OBBB as it would come to be known, begins not with a single moment, but with a series of events and promises that unfolded over the course of years. Its origins stretch back well before the bill was formally introduced in 2025, rooted in the shifting tides of American politics and the ambitions of one man determined to leave a lasting mark on the nation's legislative landscape. The conceptual seeds of the OBBB were sown during Donald Trump's relentless 2024 presidential campaign. A campaign that was as much about spectacle and showmanship as it was about policy. Trump, never one to shy away from grand gestures, made it clear from the outset that he intended to return to the White House with a bold agenda, one that would reshape the country's economic and political future. On the campaign trail, Trump's rallies became legendary for their energy and fervor. Supporters packed stadiums and fairgrounds, hanging on his every word as he painted a vision of an America restored to greatness. Again and again, he promised that a second term would bring about an economic revival unlike any seen before, a revival that would touch every corner of the country, from the smallest rural towns to the bustling urban centers. At the heart of this vision was a central pillar, the idea of making his signature 2017 tax cuts permanent. Trump spoke passionately about the need to lock in these tax reductions, arguing that they had fueled growth, created jobs, and put more money in the hands of ordinary Americans. He insisted that only by making these cuts permanent could the country avoid slipping back into what he described as the stagnation and overreach of previous administrations. But for Trump, this was more than just an economic policy. It was a fundamental commitment to the American worker and family. He framed the tax cuts as a way to ensure that more money stayed in the pockets of those who earned it, allowing families to pay their bills, save for the future, and invest in their communities. In speech after speech, he told stories of factory workers, small business owners, and parents struggling to make ends meet, promising that his plan would give them the relief they deserved. This message resonated deeply with his base. For many, it was a direct rebuke to what they saw as the tax and spend policies of his opponents. Policies they believed favored bureaucrats and special interests over ordinary Americans. Trump's supporters saw him as a champion of the people, someone willing to fight for their interests against a political establishment that seemed increasingly out of touch. Yet Trump's campaign was never just about tax relief. His rhetoric was filled with pledges to bolster national security and finally gain complete control over the country's borders. The promise to build the wall had become a rallying cry in his first campaign, and in 2024, he doubled down, vowing not only to finish the wall but to expand its reach and effectiveness. He spoke in detail about the need to finish the border wall, to expand resources for immigration enforcement, and to take a tougher stance on both legal and illegal immigration. Trump argued that a porous border threatened not just national security, but also the economic well-being of American workers, who he claimed were forced to compete with undocumented immigrants for jobs and wages. In Trump's narrative, these promises were not separate from his economic vision. They were intrinsically linked. He argued that a secure border was essential for a secure economy, and that only by addressing both issues together could the country truly prosper. This fusion of economic nationalism and hardline security policy became the core of his platform, a message he repeated at every opportunity. For Trump and his supporters, the border was more than just a line on a map. It was a symbol of sovereignty, safety, and economic opportunity. He painted a vivid picture of a nation under threat, but also of a nation poised for renewal if only it could regain control of its borders and its destiny. This blend of economic and security promises was not just a collection of talking points, it was a vision for a new kind of legislative action. Trump assured his rallies that he would enact it all in one sweeping legislative push, a big, beautiful package that would solve many of the nation's problems at once. The idea was simple but audacious. Rather than fight a series of small battles, he would launch a single, massive offensive. The concept of a single massive bill was also a strategic calculation. Trump and his advisors had learned hard lessons from the legislative battles of his first term, where individual initiatives could be stalled, watered down, or picked apart by the opposition. By bundling popular measures like tax cuts with more controversial provisions, they hoped to create a legislative vehicle that was too big and too important to fail. The memory of past defeats and gridlock in Congress loomed large. Trump's team remembered the struggles to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, the endless debates over infrastructure, and the constant threat of government shutdowns. They believed that by presenting Congress with a single comprehensive bill, they could force lawmakers to take an all-or-nothing vote, one that would be difficult to oppose without risking the wrath of voters. The strategy was clear: combine the most popular elements, tax relief, border security, support for law enforcement, with more divisive measures, and dare the opposition to vote against the whole package. In the campaign's war rooms, advisors pored over polling data and focus group results, searching for the right mix of policies that would maximize public support and minimize political risk. The campaign's message was unambiguous: a vote for Trump was a vote for this all-encompassing agenda. Television ads, social media posts, and campaign literature hammered home the point. Only Trump had the vision and the will to deliver sweeping change, and only he could be trusted to see it through. Trump promised to move with unprecedented speed, vowing to avoid the gridlock and endless debates that he claimed had plagued Washington for decades. He told his supporters that the time for talk was over, the time for action had arrived. He would not be deterred by the naysayers or the entrenched interests that had, in his view, held the country back for too long. This promise of decisive action was a powerful motivator for his voters. Many Americans, frustrated by years of political stalemate and partisan bickering, were eager for a leader who would cut through the noise and get things done. For them, Trump's pledge to deliver results, fast, was not just appealing, it was essential. The campaign trail vision set the stage for what would become the OBBB Act. It was a vision that promised not just incremental change, but a fundamental transformation of the country's economic and security policies. Trump's supporters believed that with him at the helm, America could finally break free from the cycle of disappointment and dysfunction that had defined so much of its recent history. The OBBB was not a policy document crafted in the quiet halls of Congress by legislative experts. It was a promise forged in the fire of political rallies, shaped by the cheers and demands of the American people, and broadcast directly into living rooms across the nation. It was a bill born of spectacle, of slogans, and of a deep desire for change. Even the name, One Big Beautiful Bill, was a product of this approach. It was a slogan before it was a law, a marketing tool designed to build public momentum and excitement long before a single word of the bill was written. The phrase appeared on banners, hats, and bumper stickers, becoming a rallying cry for supporters and a symbol of Trump's promise to deliver something truly historic. When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he did so with what he saw as a clear mandate from the electorate. The crowds that had cheered him on the campaign trail, the millions of votes cast in his favor, all pointed to a public hungry for bold action. He arrived determined to turn his grand campaign promises into concrete reality, setting the stage for one of the most ambitious and contentious legislative undertakings in modern American history. The OBBB was more than just a bill. It was a test of whether a campaign promise, forged in the heat of political battle, could truly reshape the nation's future. When President Trump and his Republican allies set out to pass the OBBB Act, they faced a political landscape that was anything but stable. The air in Washington was thick with uncertainty, and every move was scrutinized by both allies and adversaries. The stakes were enormous, not just for the administration but for the future direction of the country. The OBBB Act, a sweeping piece of legislation, was intended to reshape the federal government's approach to spending, taxation, and social programs. But before it could become law, it would have to survive a gauntlet of political challenges, each more daunting than the last. The 2024 elections had delivered them control of both the White House and Congress, but their majorities were perilously thin. The results were a mixed blessing, a mandate perhaps, but not a comfortable one. On election night, as the final votes were tallied and the balance of power became clear, both celebration and anxiety swept through Republican ranks. The party had achieved what many thought impossible, but the numbers told a sobering story. In both chambers, the margins were so slim that a single misstep could spell disaster. The sense of triumph was tempered by the knowledge that every vote would count, and that unity would be both essential and elusive. In the House of Representatives, Republicans held a razor-thin advantage, a situation where the defection of just a few members could doom any piece of legislation. The atmosphere on the House floor was tense, with lawmakers constantly gauging the mood of their colleagues and the shifting winds of public opinion. Every caucus meeting, every hallway conversation, every whispered aside took on outsized importance. The leadership knew that even the most minor disagreement could snowball into a full-blown crisis. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, and the pressure on individual members was immense. This meant that House Speaker Kevin McCarthy had to perform a constant balancing act, trying to appease the various factions within his own party, from staunch conservatives in the Freedom Caucus to more moderate members from swing districts who were wary of the bill's more extreme provisions. McCarthy's job was not just to count votes, but to build consensus among a group of lawmakers with wildly divergent priorities. The Freedom Caucus, emboldened by their influence, pushed for deep spending cuts and aggressive reforms, while moderates worried about alienating their constituents back home. McCarthy spent countless hours in closed-door meetings, negotiating, cajoling, and sometimes pleading with members to stay on board. The Speaker's office became a revolving door of lawmakers seeking assurances, concessions, or simply a sympathetic ear. Every day brought new challenges, and the threat of rebellion was never far from the surface. The situation in the Senate was even more precarious. While the House was a minefield of competing interests, the Senate was a high-stakes chessboard where every piece mattered. The upper chamber, known for its deliberative pace and tradition of bipartisanship, had become a battleground where the slightest shift could tip the balance of power. Senators moved through the corridors with a sense of gravity, aware that their decisions would have far-reaching consequences. The tension was palpable, and the stakes could not have been higher. The chamber was split 50-50 between Republicans and Democrats, giving Vice President J.P. Vance the crucial tie-breaking vote. This razor-thin margin meant that every single vote was a potential make-or-break moment. The vice president's role, usually ceremonial, became pivotal. J.P. Vance found himself thrust into the spotlight, his every move watched by the nation. The knowledge that he might be called upon to cast the deciding vote on one of the most consequential bills in decades weighed heavily on him. The balance of power in the Senate was as fragile as it had ever been, and the outcome of the OBBB Act hung in the balance. This 51-50 effective majority left no room for error. Every senator knew that their vote could be the one that determined the fate of the bill, and, by extension, the political fortunes of their party and the president. The atmosphere during votes was electric, with senators anxiously watching the tally board and exchanging nervous glances. The margin was so slim that even a single absence or abstention could derail the entire process. The pressure on individual senators was immense, and the leadership worked tirelessly to keep everyone in line. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell knew that he could not afford to lose a single Republican vote if he wanted to pass the OBBB Act. McConnell, a master tactician with decades of experience, approached the challenge with his trademark steely resolve. He held regular strategy sessions with his leadership team, mapping out every possible scenario and contingency. Behind closed doors, he worked the phones, reaching out to wavering senators and offering reassurances or, when necessary, applying pressure. McConnell's reputation as a deal-maker was put to the test as he navigated the competing demands of his caucus. He understood that the success or failure of the OBBB Act would define his legacy, and perhaps the future of the Republican Party itself. Every single member of his caucus, from fiscal hawks concerned about the national debt to centrists worried about the social spending cuts, held immense power. The fiscal hawks demanded strict limits on government spending and were wary of any provisions that might increase the deficit. They scrutinized every line of the bill, insisting on accountability and transparency. Meanwhile, centrist senators, many of whom represented states won by narrow margins, were acutely aware of the political risks. They faced tough questions from constituents and the media, and their support could not be taken for granted. The diversity of views within the Republican caucus made consensus building a Herculean task. The entire fate of the president's signature legislative achievement rested on keeping all 50 Republican senators in line, a monumental task given the bill's controversial nature. The OBBB Act touched on issues that were deeply divisive, both within the party and across the country. News headlines blared with stories of backroom deals, last-minute amendments, and high-stakes negotiations. The pressure on lawmakers was relentless, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. Every day brought new challenges, and the outcome was far from certain. This fragile political environment shaped every aspect of the OBBB Act's journey through Congress. Hearings were contentious, with lawmakers grilling administration officials and outside experts. Debates on the House and Senate floors were heated, with passionate speeches on both sides. The legislative process, always complex, became even more so as leaders sought to navigate the treacherous waters of partisan politics. Every amendment, every procedural vote, every public statement was carefully calculated to maximize support and minimize risk. The stakes were simply too high for mistakes. The bill was crafted using a special budgetary process known as reconciliation, which allows certain tax and spending bills to pass the Senate with a simple majority, thus bypassing the 60-vote threshold needed to overcome a filibuster. This arcane but powerful tool had been used before, most notably for major tax cuts and healthcare reforms. But reconciliation came with its own set of challenges. The rules were strict, and the Senate parliamentarian, an unelected official, held significant sway over what could and could not be included. Lawmakers and staffers pored over the rules, searching for ways to include their priorities without running afoul of the process. The tension between policy goals and procedural constraints was a constant source of frustration. While this was a necessary procedural move, it also constrained what could be included in the bill, as all provisions had to be directly related to the federal budget. This meant that many policy ideas, no matter how popular or well-intentioned, were left on the cutting room floor. Lawmakers and their aides worked late into the night, revising drafts and searching for creative solutions. Every word, every comma, every dollar had to be justified. The process was painstaking, and the margin for error was slim. The final product was a compromise, shaped as much by the rules of the Senate as by the will of the majority. This led to intense negotiations and last-minute changes, as congressional leaders worked to ensure the bill complied with the strict rules of reconciliation, while still satisfying the demands of their members. The atmosphere in congressional offices was frenetic, with staffers racing against the clock to finalize language and secure commitments. Leaders huddled in urgent meetings, hashing out compromises and making tough decisions. Exhausted aides worked by lamplight, fueled by coffee and adrenaline. The process was grueling, but the stakes were too high to allow for rest. Every detail mattered, and the outcome was far from certain. The political tightrope walk extended beyond the halls of Congress. Outside, the nation watched with bated breath as the drama unfolded. News vans lined the streets, reporters camped out on the Capitol steps, and lawmakers were besieged by questions at every turn. The story dominated headlines and cable news, with pundits and analysts dissecting every development. The public's attention was riveted, and the pressure on lawmakers was unrelenting. The fate of the OBBB Act became a national obsession, with supporters and opponents alike mobilizing to make their voices heard. With such narrow majorities, public opinion played an outsized role. Lawmakers tracked polling data obsessively, searching for signs of shifting sentiment. Focus groups were convened to test messages and gauge reactions. Political ads flooded the airwaves, targeting key districts and swing voters. The battle for public support was as fierce as the fight in Congress, and both sides spared no expense in their efforts to sway opinion. The stakes were not just legislative, but electoral. Every lawmaker knew that their vote on the OBBB Act could define their political future. Both supporters and opponents of the bill launched massive public relations campaigns, spending millions on advertising and grassroots organizing. Advocacy groups mobilized their members, flooding congressional offices with calls, emails, and letters. Volunteers canvassed neighborhoods, knocking on doors and handing out flyers. Press conferences were held, with lawmakers and activists making their case to the public. The airwaves were saturated with competing messages, each side warning of dire consequences if the bill passed or failed. The battle for hearts and minds was relentless, and the outcome was far from certain. Protests and rallies became common sights in Washington, D.C., and in key congressional districts around the country. Activists from across the political spectrum descended on the Capitol, waving signs and chanting slogans. Town hall meetings were packed with concerned citizens, eager to make their voices heard. The energy was palpable, and the sense of urgency was unmistakable. Lawmakers found themselves caught between the demands of their constituents and the imperatives of party loyalty. The pressure was intense, and the stakes could not have been higher. Every vote was a high-stakes decision for lawmakers, who had to weigh the intense pressure from the White House and their party leadership against the potential for backlash from their constituents. The phones in congressional offices rang off the hook as voters made their opinions known. Lawmakers read letters and emails late into the night, searching for guidance and reassurance. The weight of responsibility was heavy, and the consequences of each decision were profound. For many, the choice was agonizing, a delicate balance between principle, loyalty, and political survival. In the politically charged atmosphere of 2025, passing the OBBB Act was less like a legislative process and more like a high-wire act performed without a safety net. Every step was fraught with danger, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. Lawmakers moved through the Capitol with a sense of purpose and trepidation, knowing that the eyes of the nation were upon them. The outcome of the OBBB Act would shape the future of the country, and the path to passage was as narrow and perilous as any in American political history. In the end, the story of the OBBB Act was not just about policy or politics. It was about the extraordinary pressures and challenges faced by those who walk the political tightrope, and the courage it takes to make history. At its core, the One Big Beautiful Bill, known as the OBBB Act, was not just a piece of legislation, but a culmination of years of political ambition, economic theory, and the evolving priorities of the American electorate. To truly understand its foundation, we have to look back to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which was the signature legislative achievement of President Trump's first term. The TCJA, as it became known, was a sweeping overhaul of the U.S. tax code, and its legacy would echo through the halls of Congress for years to come, shaping debates, campaigns, and ultimately, the OBBB Act itself. The 2017 law marked the most significant transformation of the American tax system in over 30 years. It slashed the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, a move that was hailed by business leaders and investors as a catalyst for economic growth and global competitiveness. For individuals, the law lowered income tax rates across most brackets, increased the standard deduction, and simplified the filing process for millions of Americans. The intent was clear: to stimulate investment, create jobs, and put more money in the pockets of working families. The effects rippled through the economy, with supporters pointing to rising stock markets, increased business confidence, and a surge in consumer spending. However, the legislative process was anything but straightforward. In order to comply with the Senate's complex budget reconciliation rules, a procedural maneuver that allowed Republicans to pass the bill with a simple majority and avoid a filibuster, many of the individual tax cuts were made temporary. These provisions were set to expire at the end of 2025, creating a ticking clock that would force Congress to revisit the issue. This sunset clause was not just a technicality, it was a political time bomb, ensuring that the debate over taxes would return with even greater intensity in the years ahead. The looming expiration of these tax cuts became known as the fiscal cliff. Supporters of the TCJA warned that allowing the cuts to lapse would result in a sudden and painful tax increase for millions of Americans, potentially stalling economic growth and undermining household budgets. Opponents, on the other hand, argued that the temporary nature of the cuts was a necessary compromise to limit the bill's impact on the national debt. As the deadline approached, the stage was set for a high-stakes political showdown, with both parties preparing to make their case to the American people. During his 2024 campaign, Donald Trump seized on the issue of the expiring tax cuts, making it a central theme of his rallies and speeches. He promised not only to prevent the tax increases that would occur if the TCJA provisions expired, but to make the cuts permanent, ensuring that families and businesses could plan for the future without fear of sudden changes to the tax code. This message resonated with voters who had grown accustomed to the lower rates and higher deductions, and it became a rallying cry for his supporters across the country. The promise to lock in the tax cuts was not just a talking point, it was a cornerstone of Trump's economic platform. His campaign materials, speeches, and advertisements all emphasized the importance of tax certainty for American families and businesses. The message was simple but powerful. By making the cuts permanent, the government would provide stability, encourage investment, and support long-term economic growth. This approach was designed to appeal not only to traditional Republican voters, but also to independents and working-class Americans who had benefited from the changes enacted in 2017. Trump and his allies argued that making the tax cuts permanent would provide much-needed certainty for families planning their budgets, for entrepreneurs considering new ventures, and for investors weighing long-term commitments. The logic was straightforward. When people know what to expect from the tax code, They are more likely to make decisions that drive economic growth. For small business owners, the prospect of stable tax rates meant the ability to hire more workers, expand operations, and invest in new equipment. For families, it meant more predictable take-home pay and greater confidence in their financial future. The OBBB Act was crafted as the legislative vehicle to fulfill these promises. It was designed not only to extend the provisions of the TCJA, but to build upon them, addressing criticisms and incorporating new ideas that had emerged in the years since 2017. The bill's architects sought to create a comprehensive package that would appeal to a broad cross-section of the American public, while also navigating the complex realities of the legislative process. At the heart of the OBBB Act was the goal of locking in the lower individual income tax brackets, which ranged from 10% to 37%. These rates had provided relief to millions of households, particularly those in the middle and lower income ranges. The bill also aimed to preserve the higher standard deduction, a change that had dramatically simplified tax filing for many Americans and reduced the need for itemized deductions. By making these provisions permanent, the OBBB Act sought to ensure that the benefits of the 2017 law would not be lost to future political battles or shifting priorities in Washington. For Republicans, the OBBB Act represented the completion of a project that had begun nearly a decade earlier. The passage of the TCJA in 2017 had been a hard-fought victory, achieved through party-line votes and intense negotiations. Many in the party saw the OBBB Act as an opportunity to cement their legacy, to demonstrate their commitment to pro-growth policies, and to deliver on promises made to their constituents. The sense of urgency was palpable as lawmakers recognized that the window for action was limited and that the stakes were higher than ever. But the OBBB Act was more than just an extension of the old law. Its drafters understood that simply repeating the past would not be enough to win over skeptics or to address the evolving needs of the country. As a result, the bill included a range of new provisions, amendments, and targeted tax breaks, designed to broaden its appeal and to respond to the criticisms that had been leveled at the TCJA. Policy analysts, economists, and lawmakers pored over the details, seeking ways to fine-tune the legislation and maximize its impact. One of the most notable features of the OBBB Act was its focus on expanding the benefits of tax reform to groups that had previously felt left out. The bill introduced new targeted tax breaks aimed at specific segments of the electorate, including working-class Americans, small business owners, and families with children. These provisions were carefully crafted to address real-world concerns, such as the rising cost of living, wage stagnation, and the challenges faced by service industry workers. By tailoring the bill to meet the needs of a diverse population, its sponsors hoped to build a broader coalition of support and to counter the perception that tax reform was only for the wealthy. Among the most popular proposals were measures to eliminate federal income tax on tip income for service workers and on overtime pay for hourly employees. These changes were heavily promoted by Trump and his allies as direct benefits for the working man and woman, people who often felt overlooked by Washington and who stood to gain the most from targeted tax relief. For waitresses, bartenders, and other service workers, the promise of tax-free tips was a tangible improvement in their daily lives. For construction workers, nurses, and others who put in long hours, the elimination of taxes on overtime pay was a recognition of their hard work and dedication. These additions to the bill were not accidental. They were the result of careful political calculation and a desire to broaden the bill's appeal. By addressing the needs of working families and middle-class voters, the OBBB Act sought to counter the criticism that the 2017 law had primarily benefited corporations and the wealthy. Political strategists analyzed polling data, held focus groups, and crafted messaging designed to highlight the bill's benefits for ordinary Americans. Campaign ads featured testimonials from families, small business owners, and workers who stood to gain from the new provisions, reinforcing the idea that tax reform could be a force for good in people's everyday lives. The ultimate goal was to build a coalition of support that stretched beyond the traditional Republican base. By reaching out to independents, moderates, and even some Democrats, the bill's sponsors hoped to create a sense of national unity around the idea of tax relief and economic growth. Town hall meetings, community events, and bipartisan forums were organized to discuss the bill's provisions and to solicit feedback from constituents. The message was clear. The OBBB Act was designed to benefit all Americans, regardless of party affiliation or background. The legacy of the 2017 Act also played a crucial role in shaping the political strategy behind the OBBB Act. Lawmakers and campaign staffers studied the successes and failures of the earlier law, learning valuable lessons about messaging, coalition building, and the importance of timing. They recognized that the political environment had changed since 2017, with new challenges and opportunities on the horizon. By drawing on the experience of the past, they hoped to craft a more effective and resilient legislative strategy. Republicans had passed the TCJA on a party line vote using the reconciliation process, a legislative shortcut that allowed them to bypass the threat of a filibuster in the Senate. This time they plan to use the same playbook in 2025, leveraging their majority to push the OBBB Act through Congress. The reconciliation process was both a blessing and a curse. It made it possible to enact sweeping changes with a simple majority, but it also imposed strict limits on what could be included in the bill and how long its provisions could last. Lawmakers worked closely with parliamentary experts to ensure that the bill would withstand procedural challenges and avoid the pitfalls that had plagued earlier efforts. The messaging around the OBBB Act drew heavily on the arguments that had proven successful 7 years earlier. Supporters emphasized the importance of economic growth, global competitiveness, and tax relief for the middle class. They pointed to the successes of the 2017 law, job creation, rising wages, and a booming stock market, as evidence that tax reform could deliver real benefits for ordinary Americans. Campaign ads and speeches highlighted stories of families who had used their tax savings to buy homes, start businesses, or send their children to college, reinforcing the idea that the OBBB Act was an investment in the nation's future. However, the debate over the OBBB Act was not without controversy. Critics pointed to the ballooning national debt, arguing that the 2017 tax cuts had contributed to a growing fiscal imbalance, and that making them permanent would only exacerbate the problem. Economists and budget watchdogs warned that the country could not afford to continue cutting taxes without finding ways to offset the lost revenue. Protests and public debates erupted across the country, with activists demanding greater fiscal responsibility and a more balanced approach to tax policy. This time, Republican leaders knew that they would have to pair their tax cuts with significant spending offsets in order to win over skeptics and to ensure the bill's long-term viability. Negotiations in Congress were intense, with lawmakers debating the proper balance between tax relief and fiscal discipline. Proposals to cut government spending, reform entitlement programs, and close loopholes were all on the table, as both sides sought to shape the final version of the bill. The battle over the OBBB Act was not just about taxes. It was a broader struggle over the size and role of government, the future of the American economy, and the values that would guide the nation in the years to come. In the end, the foundation of the OBBB Act was built on a complex mix of history, politics, and policy. It was a response to the unfinished business of the 2017 tax reform, a reflection of changing economic realities, and a testament to the enduring power of tax policy to shape the nation's destiny. As the debate raged on, one thing was clear: the decisions made in Congress would have far-reaching consequences for generations of Americans, touching every corner of the economy and every aspect of daily life. The decision to bundle so many disparate and monumental policy changes into a single bill was a massive political gamble. It was a move that defied the traditional legislative process, which typically favors incremental change and careful negotiation over sweeping, all-encompassing reforms. In the halls of Congress, where every word and comma can be the subject of weeks of debate, the idea of fusing tax reform, social spending cuts, defense increases, and environmental rollbacks into one colossal package was nothing short of audacious. Lawmakers, staffers, and political observers alike recognized that this was not just another bill. It was a high-stakes wager on the very future of American governance. The OBBB Act was not just a tax bill, it was a comprehensive overhaul of national priorities. It sought to reshape the very foundation of the federal government's role in American life, touching everything from the way families file their taxes to the resources allocated for national defense, from the safety net for the most vulnerable to the regulations that protect air and water. The bill's sheer scope was unprecedented, and its ambition was matched only by the controversy it generated. By combining permanent tax cuts with deep reductions in social programs, a massive increase in defense and border spending, and significant rollbacks of environmental regulations, the Trump administration was essentially forcing an up or down vote on its entire governing philosophy. This was not just a matter of fiscal policy or regulatory reform, it was a referendum on the direction of the country. The administration's message was clear: America would be leaner, stronger, and more competitive, but also less encumbered by what it saw as burdensome social and environmental obligations. For supporters, this was a bold vision of renewal. For opponents, it was a dangerous experiment with the nation's social contract. This all-or-nothing approach was incredibly risky. In the world of politics, risk is often measured in votes, but here, the stakes were even higher. The fate of the bill would determine not only the success or failure of a legislative session, but the legacy of an entire administration. Every provision, every compromise, every line of text became a potential flashpoint for controversy or dissent. The pressure on lawmakers was immense, as they weighed the demands of party loyalty against the interests of their constituents and the judgment of history. If the bill failed, it would not just be a single policy defeat, it would be a repudiation of the president's entire second-term agenda, leaving him with few legislative pathways forward. The administration had staked its credibility, its political capital, and its vision for the country on the passage of this one bill. Failure would embolden opponents, demoralize supporters, and potentially paralyze the government's ability to act on other pressing issues. The sense of urgency was palpable, and the atmosphere in Washington grew increasingly tense as the vote approached. Supporters of this strategy argued that it was a necessary move to break through the partisan gridlock that had paralyzed Washington. For years, Congress had been mired in stalemate, with major initiatives dying in committee or falling victim to endless amendments and procedural delays. The OBBB Act, they claimed, was a way to cut through the noise and force a real decision. By putting everything on the line, they hoped to create a sense of momentum and inevitability that would carry the bill across the finish line. In their view, the country could no longer afford half measures or incrementalism. Bold action was required to meet the challenges of the moment. They believed that by creating a bill of such immense consequence, they could force a decisive outcome. The logic was simple. When the stakes are high enough, hesitation becomes impossible. Lawmakers would have to choose a side, and the country would finally get the clarity it needed. This was not just about passing legislation, it was about demonstrating leadership and resolve in the face of adversity. The supporters saw themselves as agents of change, willing to take risks that others would not. The popular appeal of the tax cuts, they hoped, would provide political cover for members who might otherwise hesitate to vote for the controversial spending reductions. Tax relief has long been a potent political tool, capable of rallying support across ideological lines. By front-loading the bill with provisions that would put more money in voters' pockets, the architects of the OBBB Act aimed to neutralize opposition to the less popular elements of the package. They calculated that in the end, most lawmakers would not want to be seen as standing in the way of a tax cut, especially with elections looming on the horizon. The thinking was that it would be harder for a moderate Republican to vote no on a bill that delivered tax relief to their constituents, even if they had reservations about other parts of the package. In districts where economic anxiety was high and trust in government was low, the promise of lower taxes could be a powerful motivator. Party leaders worked tirelessly to remind wavering members of the political benefits, emphasizing the positive headlines and campaign ads that would follow a successful vote. At the same time, they downplayed the risks, insisting that the bill's other provisions would fade into the background once the tax cuts took effect. It was a high-pressure tactic designed to unify the party and overwhelm the opposition through sheer legislative force. The leadership's message was clear. This was a test of loyalty, discipline, and commitment to the party's agenda. Behind closed doors, the pressure was relentless. Whips tracked every vote, and party leaders made personal appeals to holdouts, offering reassurances, promises, and in some cases, veiled threats. The atmosphere was electric, with every conversation, every handshake, and every glance carrying the weight of history. Critics, however, saw this strategy as a legislative Hail Mary, a desperate attempt to ram through an unpopular agenda without proper debate or scrutiny. They accused the administration of bypassing the normal checks and balances that are supposed to protect the public interest. In their view, the OBBB Act was less a bold vision than a reckless gamble, one that put ideology ahead of good governance. The speed and secrecy with which the bill was assembled only fueled suspicions, as did the sheer volume of material that lawmakers were expected to digest in a matter of days. They argued that lumping so many complex issues together prevented a thorough examination of any single one. In the rush to pass the bill, important details were overlooked, and unintended consequences became all but inevitable. Lawmakers complained that they had little time to read, let alone understand, the hundreds of pages of legal text. Experts warned that the lack of transparency and deliberation would lead to confusion, mistakes, and ultimately, public backlash. How could Congress properly debate the future of Medicaid while simultaneously considering missile defense systems and the intricacies of the estate tax? Each of these issues would normally require weeks of hearings, expert testimony, and public input. By forcing them into a single vote, critics argued, the administration was short-circuiting the democratic process. The result, they warned, would be poorly crafted laws, unintended consequences, and a loss of public trust in government. Opponents claimed this was a deliberate tactic to obscure the true costs and consequences of the bill, making it difficult for the public and even for lawmakers to fully understand what they were voting on. The complexity of the legislation became a shield, allowing controversial provisions to slip through unnoticed. Advocacy groups scrambled to analyze the bill, issuing urgent warnings about its potential impact on everything from healthcare to the environment. Meanwhile, the public was left to make sense of conflicting headlines and partisan spin. They labeled it an anti-democratic process that prioritized speed and political victory over sound policymaking. Editorial boards across the country condemned the approach, warning that it set a dangerous precedent for future legislation. Civic groups called for more transparency and accountability, arguing that the public deserved a full and open debate on issues of such importance. The controversy spilled over into the streets, with protests and rallies becoming a daily occurrence outside the Capitol. This all-in-one approach also created a fragile coalition. To pass a bill of this magnitude, party leaders had to hold together a diverse group of lawmakers, each with their own priorities, concerns, and constituencies. Every compromise risked alienating one faction or another, and the margin for error was razor-thin. The process became a delicate balancing act, with leaders constantly recalibrating their strategy in response to shifting alliances and new demands. While the strategy was intended to force party unity, it also magnified the power of any single holdout. In a closely divided Congress, one senator or representative could bring the entire process to a halt. The fate of the bill often rested on the shoulders of a handful of lawmakers, each of whom became the target of intense lobbying, media scrutiny, and public pressure. The drama played out in real time, with the nation watching as individual votes took on outsized significance. With razor-thin majorities, a senator concerned about the deficit or a House member worried about cuts to a specific program in their district could threaten to bring the entire edifice crashing down. The leadership's challenge was to address these concerns without unraveling the delicate compromises that held the coalition together. Every concession risked alienating another group, and the clock was always ticking. The sense of uncertainty was pervasive, as lawmakers weighed the risks and rewards of their decisions. The negotiations became incredibly complex, as leaders had to make concessions and side deals to appease individual members, often adding more provisions and further bloating the already massive bill. The process resembled a high-stakes game of chess, with each move carefully calculated to secure the necessary votes. Amendments were drafted and redrafted, promises were made and sometimes broken, and the bill grew ever larger and more unwieldy. The final product was a patchwork of competing interests, stitched together in the hope that it would hold long enough to secure passage. The OBBB Act became a legislative Jenga tower, growing taller and more impressive with each added piece, but also more unstable and vulnerable to collapse. Every new provision, every last-minute deal, added to the complexity and the risk. In the end, the fate of the bill, and perhaps the future of the administration, rested on whether the tower would stand or fall. The nation watched, holding its breath as lawmakers prepared to cast their votes on one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in a generation. The final journey of the One Big Beautiful Bill through the United States Congress was a spectacle of high-stakes political drama. The Capitol, bathed in the glow of television lights and surrounded by throngs of reporters, became the epicenter of a national debate that would shape the country's future. For weeks, the air was thick with anticipation, as lawmakers, staffers, and journalists alike sensed that history was about to be made. The stakes could not have been higher, and every corridor of power buzzed with rumors, speculation, and last-minute maneuvering. The process began in the House of Representatives in the spring of 2025, where every vote was counted and recounted. The House chamber, usually a place of routine legislative business, was transformed into a battleground. Members huddled in small groups, whispering urgently, their faces etched with anxiety. The tension was palpable as the outcome was far from certain. Each vote carried enormous weight, and the margin for error was razor-thin. The Republican leadership, under immense pressure from the White House, engaged in a furious lobbying campaign to whip their members into line. The Speaker's office became a revolving door, with lawmakers summoned for private meetings, their political futures hanging in the balance. The leadership team worked around the clock, fielding calls from donors, strategists, and even the president himself, who was not shy about making his expectations clear. They twisted arms, made promises, and appealed to party loyalty, knowing that they could only afford to lose a handful of votes. Some members were offered coveted committee assignments, while others were reminded of the consequences of defection. The pressure was relentless, and the atmosphere inside the Capitol was charged with a sense of urgency and, for some, dread. Deals were struck in back rooms, and alliances were tested as the clock ticked down to the final vote. The debate on the House floor was acrimonious, with Democrats staging marathon speeches to condemn the bill as a reckless giveaway to the rich and a betrayal of working families. The rhetoric was fiery, with lawmakers invoking the Founding Fathers, the American dream, and the struggles of ordinary citizens. Some speeches were broadcast live on cable news, turning the House floor into a stage for political theater. The gallery was packed with activists, lobbyists, and concerned citizens, all watching intently as the drama unfolded. While Republicans hailed it as a historic opportunity to unleash American prosperity, they argued that the bill would spur economic growth, create jobs, and restore America's competitive edge. Supporters of the bill spoke with conviction, painting a vision of a brighter future and dismissing critics as out of touch with the needs of the country. The divide between the two parties was stark, and the debate often devolved into shouting matches and personal attacks. On May 22, 2025, the House held its final vote. The session stretched late into the night, with lawmakers pacing the aisles and conferring in hushed tones. The clock ticked past midnight, but no one dared to leave. The fate of the bill, and perhaps the fate of the Congress itself, hung in the balance. The Speaker called the chamber to order, and the roll call began. The chamber was electric with tension as the electronic tally board lit up. Every eye was fixed on the numbers as they flickered and changed, each new vote sending ripples of anxiety through the room. Some lawmakers clasped their hands in silent prayer, while others stared stoically ahead, unwilling to betray their emotions. The press gallery was silent, save for the furious tapping of reporters' keyboards. For hours, the vote remained too close to call, with a small group of moderate Republicans and fiscal conservatives holding out. These lawmakers, often from swing districts or with reputations for independence, found themselves at the center of a political storm. Lobbyists and activists flooded their offices with calls and emails, urging them to stand firm or to compromise. The pressure was immense, and the outcome uncertain until the very last moment. In the end, after intense last-minute negotiations, the leadership secured just enough support. Promises were made, concessions were granted, and a few wavering members were finally persuaded to vote yes. The sense of relief among the bill's supporters was palpable, but so too was the exhaustion. The process had taken a toll on everyone involved, and the chamber was filled with a mix of jubilation and fatigue. The final vote was 215 to 214, with one member voting present. The narrowness of the margin underscored just how contentious the bill had been, and how divided the House remained. The clerk's voice rang out, announcing the result to a chamber that seemed to hold its breath. The OBBB Act had passed the House by the narrowest possible margin. Some lawmakers wept openly, overcome by the emotion of the moment, while others embraced their colleagues or simply sat in stunned silence. The gallery erupted in cheers and boos, reflecting the deep divisions in the country at large. The chamber erupted with Republicans cheering in triumph and Democrats shouting in protest. The scene was chaotic, with lawmakers waving papers, shouting slogans, and in some cases, storming out of the chamber in frustration. The speaker struggled to maintain order as the passions of the moment boiled over. It was a victory, but it was a victory that underscored the deep divisions within the country, and even within the ruling party itself. Some Republicans, though publicly celebrating, privately worried about the political cost of their vote. Democrats vowed to fight on, promising to make the bill a central issue in the next election. The sense of uncertainty was pervasive, and few believed that the battle was truly over. The fight then moved to the Senate, where the odds were even steeper. The Senate, known for its slower pace and more deliberative style, became the new arena for the bill's supporters and opponents. Senators returned from their home states to find their offices besieged by constituents, advocacy groups, and the national media. The pressure was, if anything, even greater than in the House. With the chamber tied 50-50, the bill's fate rested in the hands of Vice President J.P. Vance. The Vice President, a figure often relegated to ceremonial duties, suddenly found himself at the center of the nation's attention. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, was scrutinized for clues about how he might vote. The tension in the Senate chamber was almost unbearable. The Senate embarked on a grueling 48-hour debate, a period known as vote-a-rama, where senators from both parties could offer an unlimited number of amendments. The process was exhausting, with lawmakers working through the night, fueled by coffee and adrenaline. Staffers scurried back and forth, delivering stacks of amendments and briefing their bosses on the latest developments. The atmosphere was one of controlled chaos, as senators jockeyed for position and tried to outmaneuver their opponents. Democrats used this process to force Republicans to take politically painful votes on issues like protecting Medicare, knowing that these votes would be remembered by voters back home. They introduced amendment after amendment, each designed to put their opponents on the spot. The debate grew heated, with senators trading barbs and accusations well into the early hours of the morning, preserving clean energy tax credits and highlighting the potential consequences of rolling them back. Environmental groups rallied outside the Capitol, holding signs and chanting slogans, while inside senators argued over the future of America's energy policy. The stakes were enormous, and both sides knew that the outcome would have far-reaching consequences, and preventing cuts to student aid. Student groups organized rallies and sit-ins, demanding that their voices be heard. Senators fielded calls from university presidents, parents, and students themselves, all urging them to protect funding for higher education. The debate over student aid became a flashpoint, symbolizing the broader struggle over the nation's priorities. They hoped to either peel off a Republican senator or, at the very least, create potent attack ads for the next election cycle. Political strategists worked late into the night, crafting messages and testing slogans. The battle for public opinion was as fierce as the battle on the Senate floor, with both sides pouring resources into media campaigns and grassroots organizing. The debate raged through the night and into the next day, a testament to the bill's profound implications. Senators took turns speaking, some delivering impassioned speeches, others quietly conferring with colleagues. The chamber, usually a place of decorum and order, became a crucible of democracy, where every word and every vote mattered. The climax arrived on July 1, 2025. After days of debate, the Senate was exhausted but resolute. The sun rose over the Capitol, casting long shadows across the dome as senators prepared for the final vote. The nation watched, riveted, as the moment of decision approached. After dozens of amendments were voted down on party-line votes, the final roll call on the OBBB Act began. The clerk read out the names one by one as senators pressed their voting buttons. The chamber was silent, save for the steady cadence of the roll call and the occasional murmur from the gallery. As the clerk called the names, the tally remained deadlocked at 50-50. The tension was unbearable, with senators glancing nervously at the tally board and at each other. Some clutched rosaries or family photos, seeking comfort in the midst of uncertainty. The outcome would hinge on a single vote. All eyes turned to the vice president who presided over the chamber. J.P. Vance, aware of the gravity of the moment, took a deep breath before rising to speak. The chamber fell silent, every senator and every American watching on television waiting for his decision. In a moment broadcast live across the nation, J.P. Vance cast the tie-breaking vote. His words were measured, but his voice carried the weight of history. The gavel came down and the chamber erupted in a mix of cheers and groans. The decision was final, and the bill had passed. On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 50, he announced. The announcement echoed through the chamber, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Senators hugged, wept, or simply sat in stunned silence, processing the enormity of what had just happened. The one big beautiful bill is passed. The text of the bill, hundreds of pages long, was displayed on screens throughout the Capitol. Lawmakers held up copies of the legislation, some beaming with pride, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The moment was both triumphant and sobering, as everyone understood the magnitude of the decision. The gavel fell, sealing the bill's passage through Congress. The sound reverberated through the chamber, signaling the end of a long and bitter struggle. The clerk recorded the final passage and the Senate prepared to move on to other business. Though the echoes of the debate would linger for months to come, it was a monumental legislative victory for President Trump, achieved on a razor's edge in a deeply divided government, and one that would define his presidency. The White House erupted in celebration, with aides and supporters congratulating each other on a hard-fought win. News outlets flashed headlines announcing the historic vote, and pundits began to speculate about what it would mean for the country's future. And it set the stage for a new and, honestly, pretty uncertain chapter in American policy. As lawmakers filed out of the chamber, some looked relieved, others apprehensive. The nation, still deeply divided, braced for the next chapter in its ongoing political saga, knowing that the passage of the one big beautiful bill was not the end, but only the beginning of a new era of debate, challenge, and change.